Alright, this is my passage analysis for an excerpt from the short story A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings by Gabriel Garcia-Marquez. Here we go. First, I'm going to start with some background. Gabriel Garcia-Marquez is a Latin American author. He's from Colombia, and one of the literary genres there that is eventually spread throughout the rest of the world is the magical realism. And what that means is that Marquez writes a lot about fantastical situations with magical creatures, magical characters, but they also feature realistic depictions of everyday life. So he will feature a lot of regular human beings alongside these magical characters in his stories, and the idea is that the characters respond the same way that they would in real life. Another important aspect of his story, this story at least in particular, is dramatic or objective point of view, which means that we're not seeing directly into most people's minds. There are points where we do see a little bit of that, and I'll point those out as we go through. The final thing to note before we start is that I'm not actually going to be introducing the angel, the title Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, to you guys, because that happens before the excerpt that I'll be reading. So suffice it to say that he is a very old man, and he has wings. People expect that if he's a man with wings, he must be an angel, and he appears at the beginning of the story in the backyard of Pelayo and Elisenda. On the following day, everyone knew that a flesh-and-blood angel was held captive in Pelayo's house. Against the judgment of the wise neighbor woman, for whom angels in those times were the fugitive survivors of a celestial conspiracy, they did not have the heart to club him to death. Pelayo watched over him all afternoon from the kitchen, armed with his bailiff's club, and before going to bed he dragged him out of the mud and locked him up with the hens in the wire chicken coop. In the middle of the night, when the rain stopped, Pelayo and Elisenda were still killing crabs. A short time afterward, the child woke up without a fever and with the desire to eat. Then they felt magnanimous and decided to put the angel on a raft with fresh water and provisions for 3 days and leave him to his fate on the high seas. But when they went out into the courtyard with the first light of dawn, they found the whole neighborhood in front of the chicken coop having fun with the angel, without the slightest reverence, tossing him things to eat through the openings in the wire as if he weren't a supernatural creature, but a circus animal. Father Gonzaga arrived before 7 o'clock, alarmed at the strange news. By that time, onlookers less frivolous than those at dawn had already arrived, and they were making all kinds of conjectures concerning the captive's future. The simplest among them thought that he should be named mayor of the world. Others of sterner mind thought that he should be promoted to the rank of the 5-star general in order to win all wars. Some visionaries hoped that he could be put to stud in order to implant the earth a race of winged wise men who could take charge of the universe. But Father Gonzaga, before becoming a priest, had been a robust woodcutter. Standing by the wire, he reviewed his catechism in an instant, and asking them to open the door so that he could take a close look at that pitiful man who looked more like a huge decrepit hen among the fascinated chickens. He was lying in the corner drying his open wings in the sunlight among the fruit peels and breakfast leftovers that the early risers had thrown him. Alien to the impertinences of the world, he only lifted his antiquarian eyes and murmured something in his dialect when Father Gonzaga went into the chicken coop and said good morning to him in Latin. The parish priest had his first suspicion of an impostor when he saw that he did not understand the language of God or know how to greet his ministers. Then he noticed that seen close up he was much too human. He had an unbearable smell of the outdoors, the backside of his wings was strewn with parasites, and his main feathers had been mistreated by terrestrial winds, and nothing about him measured up to the proud dignity of angels. Then he came out of the chicken coop and in a brief sermon warned the curious against the risks of being ingenuous. He reminded them that the devil had the bad habit of making use of carnival tricks in order to confuse the unwary. He argued that if wings were not the essential element in determining the difference between a hawk and an airplane, they were even less so in the recognition of angels. Nevertheless, he promised to write a letter to his bishop so that the latter would write his primate so that the latter would write his supreme pontiff in order to get the final verdict from the highest courts. His prudence fell on sterile hearts. The news of the captive angel spread with such rapidity that after a few hours the courtyard had the bustle of a marketplace, and they had to call in troops with fixed bayonets to disperse the mob that was about to knock the house down. Elisenda, her spine all twisted from sweeping up so much marketplace trash, then got the idea of fencing in the yard and charging 5 cents admission to see the angel. So now I'm going to start my interpretation of this story. Here we go. The first thing we notice here is there's a lot of juxtapositions. Magical realism is built on juxtapositions between the magical and the real. And so right in the first line of this excerpt we have flesh and blood angel, which is almost an oxymoron in this case. We have angel, which is a celestial supernatural being, and then we have flesh and blood because this angel, quote unquote, is a very real character and very physical. He's always described very physically, so that's interesting. Another interesting thing is the fact that he's locked up in a chicken coop. It juxtaposes the fantastical sort of strangeness of the angel with the banality of farm animals. Another interesting thing to note, not actually in this, but by the end of the story, the chicken coop is still referred to as the chicken coop, not as, they don't change the name, call it like the angel's room. Which is interesting because even the arrival of a magical being doesn't really change life that much for Pelayo and Elisenda. Another thing we have is the first outside character, who is described here. It's the neighbor woman, and she doesn't actually get a name. I consider that to be a symbol of the fact that she is sort of a lot of different people all at once. And the idea is that she's kind of a stock character. She's the town gossip of any town, and we have people who talk a lot and always give their opinion on anything that you think. And this woman does the same. It's applied to a new magical situation, but it gives the same results. She tells them what they should do about a new situation. The other interesting thing that we have is some irony. The neighbor woman is described as wise, and throughout this entire story, the dramatic point of view will sometimes drop its facade a little bit in order to describe a particular character with a particular word. In this case, the neighbor woman is described as wise, even though her ideas aren't exactly wise. And it's sort of a jab at the woman, but in some ways it describes them in the way that they consider themselves. And so I'll be pointing out other examples of that, where it uses the word that they consider to be the truth, even if it's not really. So in the next section here, we have some ambiguity. It's unclear whether the child wakes up without the fever because of the arrival of the angel, or because of other miraculous instances, or simply because the fever breaks. These are all things that might happen. Magical realism doesn't exactly give us answers on that front, so that's an interesting development there. And then we have some major characterization of Pelayo and Elisenda. It says they felt magnanimous, and this is important because it doesn't say that they were magnanimous. It doesn't say that they are, as people, generous. What it says is that after the child wakes up without the fever, then they felt magnanimous. They decided that because they felt good, because something good had happened to them, they were going to act good as well. And even if the event is miraculous, they act the same way as we do, right? When something good happens to us, we're going to act nice to other people. We have some more characterization here, this time of the entire neighborhood. They show up without the slightest reverence and start tossing the angel things to eat, doing different things. And again, another sort of instance of the idea that nothing really changes. Even when you have supernatural beings, if there's something new in your neighborhood, people are going to show up and kind of gawk at it. And that's exactly what they do. The other thing we have is some foreshadowing. As we know later in the story, Elisenda is going to actually start treating him exactly like a circus animal, by charging people to see him. In this section, we have Father Gonzaga introduced, but not really talked about yet. First, we have some more characterization of the onlookers. And again, we have some very ironic use of specific words. It's all words that they consider themselves to be, but not necessarily the narrator. The narrator calls the onlookers less frivolous, even though they are considering that maybe he should be named mayor of the world. He describes those of sterner mind, say that he should be promoted to the rank of 5-star general, and the third people he calls them visionaries, even though their ideas are kind of ridiculous. The repeated similar syntax is also important because it gives the reader a sense of repetition, which is the idea. It's obviously repeated, and it's the idea that the people are going on for a long time. They keep saying the same sort of things. Nothing new under the sun. Here we have some more direct characterization of Father Gonzaga. He, before becoming a priest, had been a robust woodcutter. And again, the word robust. Is he actually a robust person? Perhaps not, but he considers himself a robust person. And this may be ironic. It actually becomes quite ironic later on. He reviews his catechism and takes a look at the angel, who now looks more like a huge decrepit hen. So he, by being next to the chickens in the chicken coop, he actually has almost become one. This is very important simile because there's not very much figurative language throughout this dramatic point of view story. It's very straightforward, but occasionally we do get this vivid imagery, and the juxtaposition again of the supernatural and the natural is very clear here. The parish priest is suspicious that the angel is actually an imposter. So despite considering himself robust and down to earth, he suspects the angel of some kind of magical conspiracy. His tests are kind of goofy. Knowledge of Latin obviously doesn't determine whether you're good or not. And he also assumes that he's a minister of God and that he knows the language of God. So it turns out that Father Gonzaga proves himself to be pretty idiosyncratic, just like the other characters, despite considering himself to be a very down-to-earth, hardcore character. In this next section, we have very, very vivid imagery. We have some olfactory imagery and some visual imagery describing the angel himself. And then at the end, again, the narrator allows Gonzaga's voice to shine through a little bit when he mentions that nothing about him measured up to the proud dignity of angels. And this assessment is fully based on a visual examination of the angel. Gonzaga isn't really taking stock of who the angel is, really. He's just sort of taking a look and then deciding whether he thinks that he's good or not. This is, again, proving that Gonzaga really isn't all that he's cracked up to be, and we know some people like that as well. It's a normal way to be. So he leaves, and Father Gonzaga returns to the rest of the people and begins to function just like the neighbor woman as a bit of a stock character. He's the kind of pastor or priest, we have lots of characterization here, who takes any chance he can get to give a, quote, brief sermon. And brief may be used ironically. I'll talk about that in the next slide. But he jumps immediately from the man being an angel to him being literally an instrument of the devil. Even a fantastical occurrence doesn't give Father Gonzaga pause. It doesn't change his response. He just does the exact same thing that he would to anything unexpected or new, which is, this could be dangerous. Please don't go crazy with it. And everybody knows some pastors who are like that. We also have the mention of an airplane, which gives us a bit of setting outside of the fact that we're in an area which speaks Spanish, probably on a coast somewhere. And that setting is the time, because it's easy to assume that these characters are all from the past, but here we have quite clearly that this is almost to the present, because we have airplanes. And so it just connects the characters even closer to today, right? The fact is that all humans react this way. It's not just silly humans from the past. Even we might have the same responses. In this next section, Gonzaga again shows his idiosyncratic way of looking at the world. He promises to write a letter to his bishop. The bishop will write to the primate, and the primate will write to literally the Pope himself. And again, we have some more syntax, which goes on and repeats itself a lot, illustrating probably that this, quote, brief sermon is actually quite long. He goes on, talking about the very same things that really don't matter. And the final section here, we have again another biting bit of irony. Father Gonzaga describes his own speech as prudence, or the narrator does, or he does through the narrator. But really, it's pretty clear that what he's saying doesn't really make much sense. And finally, we have characterization of Elisenda and Pelayo in their decision to fence off the yard and actually turn the angel into a circus animal, pretty much. And this is a main conceit of the rest of the story, but it gives us more characterization of Elisenda, because the idea is not that Elisenda interacts with the angel in a different way from normal. The idea rather is that something abnormal shows up, and Elisenda deals with it normally. When there's anything that's out of the blue and you can make some money off it, why not? That's Elisenda's idea. And she completes the story of all these different characters who, despite meeting a character who is completely different from anything they've ever seen before, he's possibly angelic, definitely unnatural or supernatural, The neighbor woman still gossips and tells people what to do. The priest still preaches. And Elisenda still tries to make some cash on the side. That's my analysis. Thanks.